Welcome to the third and final webinar in this three-part series that explores collaborative practice for safety and well-being of children experiencing family violence through the lens of family services, perpetrator services, and specialist family violence services. My name's Michelle Perry and I'll be your facilitator for this webinar, and I'd like to start out by thanking the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare, No to Violence and Domestic Violence Victoria for putting together this series of webinars to assist in this very important work that we do. This webinar is entitled Coordinated and Collaborative Responses, Adolescents Experiencing Family Violence. And as we can all appreciate, it extremely complex topic. And we have a whole variety of webinar panelists here, experts in their field. So looking forward to the discussion. The next slide, please, Emma. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today across Victoria, maybe across Australia. And I would like to, on all our behalf, pay respects to elders past and present, and in particular any First Nations people with us today. Next slide, thanks. Okay, just a bit of housekeeping. So the questions, this is a very short webinar, so questions will be taken on notice, so please feel free to put any questions in the chat, but we won't be referring to that today. Any sort of technical issues, we've got a contact there with Pearl, and of course the advice is leaving the session and rejoining is often the best way to fix anything. And the session is being recorded today. So if you have any concerns, let us know after the webinar. Next slide. So today's conversation will explore the three main areas is the uniqueness of the considerations for adolescents who are experiencing family violence, the unique impacts on those people. How do we maintain an adolescent focus on our responses, even when we're not particularly working specifically with the adolescent, and how to collaboratively manage the family violence risks? Next slide. I think it's also important to note, particularly because we'll be looking at a family violence case study, that our topics and our the discussion this morning isn't necessarily a pleasant one. It may be quite triggering for some people. So we're just encouraging anyone who's viewing this webinar who needs to take a break to do so. And we've just provided some support telephone numbers there in case you feel the need to do that. So when we talk about MARAM and the MARAM framework, there are three areas we'd like to highlight this morning. Firstly, that MARAM makes it very clear that there are specific and serious impacts on young people that experience family violence, and that we need to recognise them as victim survivors in their own right. We also understand that due to the developmental needs of children, and in particularly this morning, the adolescent victim survivors, there's unique vulnerabilities and needs that we need to have in mind. And finally, MARAM makes it very clear that considering and responding to the needs of young people, children, infants, and adolescents is every practitioner's responsibility. And this is particularly part of the discussion we're having this morning, is the fact that regardless of whether you're working directly with the young person, there's a responsibility there. So if I can go to the next slide, and I'd love to introduce our panellists. First of all, we have Sam Caldera. Sam is a men's behaviour change facilitator. Sarah Dobby is the Manager of Youth Services at Task Force. Marilyn Craner is the Manager, Individual and Family Services at Jewish Care. And finally, Asha Pedestetti is the Harmony Project Case Manager at In Touch. And I'd like to welcome them all here this morning. So I'm just going to finally go have a look at the case study that we're going to be working from. And I'll read it through, bear with me, just to give you all a chance to have a read through it as well. And then we'll get to our panellists and our discussion. So 16-year-old Avi lives with his father Yossel, Joseph, and mother Hannah, and siblings Sarah, Rivka, Esther, Aaron. The family are ultra-Orthodox Jewish. Hannah was born in Australia and Yossel in Israel, and their marriage was arranged. One night, a neighbour, not from the ultra-Orthodox community, overhears Yossel becoming increasingly abusive towards Hannah and Avi and calls police out of concern. Upon police attendance, everyone in the family minimises the incident, and with no physical evidence no charges are laid. Police advised Hannah to call the Orange Door for support. She is worried if she discloses the family violence, it will impact the family's status in the community and Avi's prospects of marriage. However, wanting to avoid further police involvement, she decides to call the Orange Door. The Orange Door work alongside Jewish Care to support culturally safe engagement. Through this work and with information sharing, services gain more information about the situation. Yossel has always been controlling, financially and verbally abusive towards Hannah, and cites scripture to justify his behaviour. Yossel doesn't give Hannah enough to buy groceries, and Hannah has started to send Avi and Esther to the shops due to shame regarding her unpaid accounts. In the last 6 months, the violence has worsened. Yossel has become physically abusive, and Avi has been injured trying to protect his mother. Avi goes to a religious school where his attendance has worsened, and teachers have noticed he is falling asleep in class, and he's distracted and quiet. Avi's grades have been poor in his religious studies, and he has been pushing back about on attending cultural and religious activities. Avi has started to smoke marijuana to cope with what's happening at home, which Hannah has started to suspect. He is also resisting family pressure about preparing for marriage, and Yossel is becoming verbally abusive and threatening about Avi's refusal. And now, with all of that, we're going to get into some questions. I'd like to start off firstly with just the acknowledgement that As I stated before, working with adolescents who are experiencing family violence is very complex, and we absolutely understand that it is quite common for adolescents who are experiencing family violence to be also using family violence in the home. We have decided to focus only on the experience of RV as a victim survivor in this context, but we certainly do acknowledge that he might be using family violence as a way and as an impact of what's going on in his life. So the first question, I'm going to start off with Marilyn. Marilyn, we've already had Jewish care as part of the case study in this instance. So given that case study, how would your organisation be working with the consideration of the impacts, what's happening with RV in particular?
Thanks, Michelle. I think firstly, just to kind of qualify, is that we're a bit in a unique situation because we're not only a family services provider, but we're also a COLD provider. So it does provide a bit of uniqueness, and I might kind of separate that at times to talk about who a family services provider might consult with, other than if you're a COLD provider. But whilst this scenario really talks about this case coming through the orange door, and that does absolutely occur, our experiences is that a lot of cases, in a lot of cases, the COLD families and in our experience, Jewish families will often engage with community organisations directly, although seldom disclosing family violence at the start. Like with others, there can be a lot of shame and guilt, but this can often is exaggerated in highly religious communities or in cultural groups that are more isolated from the mainstream. And for this family, the impact of either Avi or Hannah disclosing family violence is really compounded by a set of religious norms and expectations that have mothers carry the responsibility for keeping what's called shalom bayit, or a peaceful, righteous home, and it has expectations on adolescents, particularly males, for following a religious pathway that often does include arranged marriages. So it's therefore probably more likely that family violence in these communities remains really hidden under a blanket of silence for quite a long time, and that help seeking then takes a different pathway. This family may have contacted Jewish Care to seek material aid or financial aid, for example, or to seek food support, or perhaps engage with one of our services, such as our housing support. There can be a huge amount of constraints to help seeking outside of one's community. And so I think we need to be really alert and aware to it, which is why MARAM is kind of a very useful tool to ask questions very carefully and sometimes over time to reveal what's going on. So it's a very slow engagement process not to lose these families and not to lose these adolescents.
Thanks for that, Marilyn. Asha, what would you be seeing working with this family?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. So what we'd be seeing is coming from In Touch, which is a statewide specialist family violence service, and we work with immigrant and refugee backgrounds. So our understanding would be that in a lot of migrant families, both the parents work, and at times maybe only the father works, but the mother is the sole support person at home. So as, sorry, I forgot the previous speaker's name, but as she had suggested, most of the migrant families have very little support in Australia. So sometimes the grandparents are there to support them after school, but more or less the children have to take themselves home. And actually, if there are other siblings as well, they have to help look after those siblings. And when there's family violence, again, there is silence, not not talking about it. And in these instances, what we do see is the mother who is mainly taken as the main caregiver is not available for the children, meaning that she's not present to the children's needs. And a lot of times, if for a person like Avi who is getting into trouble, the first time the parents hear about it is when the school contacts them and says, Avi is having issues in school, he's not concentrating, not attending school. So only when the school steps in, the families become aware that the child has not been attending school, and there's a lot of issues happening as well. And also, there's a huge expectation placed on male adolescent children as well in migrant families. And they need to be, speaking from a South Asian background, children are expected to perform well at school, and sometimes they're expected to get scholarships to select schools as well. So again, there's another layer of shame that can be brought about because we may or may not be performing well in school as well. So, so there's, at the end of the day, there's a lot of pressure for the child to perform as expected by the family, and at the same time to perform well in school and take on all the responsibilities they're expected to take on coming to a new country. Thank you.
So Asha, it's not just the particular age of the child experiencing family violence. Gender also plays a role in that. You know, Avi being a male has different pressures and therefore may experiencing family violence differently.
Yes, definitely, because especially if Avi is the oldest of the siblings, he would probably also be expected to collect other children from their schools and bring them back home. And if there's no other caregiver at home, he would probably be expected to look after the kids till the parents return from work, or to take on a more responsible role because he's male. So that's another added layer of pressure for the child.
Okay. So Sam, you're the men's behaviour change program facilitator. In your assessment with Yossel, you're working with the family in that way. What are you likely to be hearing about RV in that instance?
Thanks, Michelle, and morning to everyone. Yes, I'll just first give you a snapshot of what the Men's Behavior Change Program is about for some of the people who are taking part today in the webinar. So it's a 20-week program, basically accredited by Not Violence in Victoria. The programs we run goes for 20 weeks, 2 hours a week, mostly run after hours for men to participate conveniently, not clashing with their work commitments and so on. So it's all about, the program is about making them responsible, making them accountable for their actions, basically family violence that they have inflicted on their family, the loved ones. Doesn't need to be particularly the intimate partner. In this case, it is Avi, who's also affected as an adolescent child. So obviously, his Avi would be also a consideration when the user was referred or self-referred to a program. So one of the key components of the program, Michelle, is also about working about impacts of family violence on children. So that's one of the key things that we get men to speak about. So it is again collaboratively managing the risks of family violence when it comes to this family, adolescent child and the other children. Yes, we take men's behavior change facilitators, take serious considerations into that. And I will talk later about the family safety work and how we work on that. But then again, one of the key things about the program is about talking regarding the impacts of family violence on children as well.
Thanks, Sam. Now, Sarah, you're working directly with adolescents. So in this regard, what are you likely to be seeing from RV?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So I guess one thing that we see with young people who are exposed to violence is that they tend to sort of make decisions and use resources that are available to them in order to keep them safe and to manage their own safety. And so it can be seen in a range of different ways, but you'll likely see people absconding from home or from placement or wherever the violence is being experienced. You'll also see them associating with peers a lot more or going towards something that they feel safe and secure in. And the unfortunate thing with that is that sometimes these peer associations can be negative as well. So you might see things like an increase in drug use. You could also see RV engaging in survival behaviours as well. So things like stealing essential items, things like deodorants or food or things like that, which can have some really negative impacts on him also. And then another thing that we will see a lot of is an underreporting of the violence or the situation at home. And this can be for a range of different reasons, but, things like fear of punishment from parents or from authority figures or caregivers, a sense of failure for the young person as well. You also at times can see the young person wanting to kind of handle it themselves, and so therefore not really disclosing it to workers, and kind of taking, asserting some independence in the situation and actually wanting to take control of it themselves. Fear of retribution, and safety concerns as well for the other family members. So if this young person is to report it to a worker, what does that then mean for the family?
Okay, so there's a lot of considerations there where he wouldn't necessarily be presenting as the model student or the pillar of the community. He may be quite surly and uncooperative in your engagement with him.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's really pivotal to establish trust in that initial engagement, and let him know that you're there to work with him and to try and sort of help him navigate the situation.
Right. And I'd like to finally just touch on the fact that there's the disclosure about planned marriage for RV. He's 16 years old. Of course, in my understanding and my experience, that's quite shocking. But I'm thinking, and Marilyn, you might have more to say on this, that would be something that he maybe has accepted, and how would that kind of play out in that regard, Marilyn?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Michelle, and it does seem shocking to lots of people, but it's very integral to the workings of particularly the ultra-Orthodox. So for them, it's not unusual or out of the norm, and at 16, it's a planning phase as well. But for young adolescent men, there are two really important bits of their bits to focus on at the age of 16. One is their religious studies, and really by 16, all the mainstream education around maths and English, that's all gone. This is now really focused on religious studies. You might find people in the ultra-Orthodox community who probably, may only get up to, a 12-year-old level of English and maths and not further than that, because really the focus for these young men is religious studies, and then planning to begin families, and that's where marriage is. So you can imagine how much pressure for someone who might be questioning for a time when there's, they're trying to individuate and separate from family, and might not necessarily want to walk that same pathway, particularly when they see their home environment not necessarily, you know, celebrating that pathway where there may be violence and lots of verbal aggression and stuff, how difficult it is, and what sort of challenges are going into that young person's head at that time. So really then, you know, the focus has to shift. There has to be sort of pathways to engagement that allows slow disclosure of what may be going on, because to start to not only disclose what's happening in the family, and in ultra-Orthodox communities, you don't talk about what happens in your family. It's very private and it's, you know, it's very shameful, let alone, you know, try and talk about what you fear about perhaps getting married or not wanting to follow a religious pathway. That can be tumultuous. So we're lucky in this scenario in some ways that Avi's only started to, you know, delve into marijuana use and to sort of just some resistant behaviour. I think if it's left you know, if no one intervenes earlier, this can blow up, and we do see scenarios where these young adolescents blow up. They, you know, many eventually leave these communities, but the damage they do to themselves along the way is bad. So this is in some way in an Orthodox community an early intervention. Now that we're talking about it, so it's very good that we are, but it is a very slow journey.
And just being 16 in itself is hard enough. So, yeah. If I can go back to you, Sam. Now, the second question is around thinking about MARAM and the focus on coordinated and collaborative responses. So how does that look in your organisation? What information is shared using the FIS and the CIS?
Yes, so Michelle, in this particular case, USL could be referred by Orange Door, police, or could be a self-referral, again, could be referred by the Jewish care. So when we get the referral, we get a fair amount of information according to the information sharing scheme, you know, framework as well. So once we get the referral, the agency would speak to the person, in this case, again, user, invite him for 2 assessment interviews. Each would go for about 90 minutes. And then during that time, explore more about his views and his use of violence and whether he's accountable, whether taking responsibility and so on and so forth. And then sometimes with the referral pack, we might even get the L17 when the police attends to an incident. They generate this particular document, which also would have been referred, gone to actually Orange Door, where Orange Door would share with us. So leaving that aside, we would invite man to really disclose about his use of violence. That's the whole idea of men getting into this program. So we would invite him to share that. And one of the main aspects, Michelle, is a man should take certain amount of responsibility, if not full responsibility, for his actions to be in the group. Because what we believe in is change is possible. So men needs to take responsibility, and in that group setting, which is usually about 15 men in a group with 2 facilitators, a female facilitator and a male facilitator. So what we would do is get all this information, weave them in, and produce produce them when it comes to the group sessions.
Great. Now, Sarah, if you're working directly with Avi, how does what sort of collaboration are you likely to do? And I'm thinking in particular how that confidentiality. How do you talk to Avi about that confidentiality?
Yeah, good question. So obviously confidentiality is paramount when working with young people, and especially if we are looking for them to disclose certain things that are incredibly sensitive to them. Obviously, you know, there is mandatory reporting and child safety frameworks that we have to follow as well, and which are there to keep them safe. So we absolutely, that is, you know, key to the work that we do. And it's something that we are very, very overt with young people about. We discuss with them why we, you know, follow these frameworks, the need for them, what their purpose is, you know, the parameters around them as well. So what would be a disclosure that we would then have to go and speak to someone about, you know. So just making sure that it's all very upfront in the beginning and they know what they're actually getting into when they're starting to work with an agency or starting to work with a youth AOD worker. First and foremost, we would be insisting, knowing that there is family violence going on at the house, we would be insisting that there is a care team around the young person, just so that everything, it reduces the risk of collusion with anyone, any of the family members, and it means that everyone is on the same page and everyone's aware of exactly what's going on, whilst making sure that Arvy's privacy is still there. So, you know, there would be certain information that Arvy would share with us that we wouldn't be disclosing to the care team, and that would be a discussion that we would have with Arvy.
Thank you. It's really tricky, isn't it? You know, how do you balance that, you know, engagement with him and, you know, but then, you know, keep him informed about your boundaries and your limitations?
It's incredibly hard and incredibly hard for young people to understand. And when you, you know, encompass developmental trauma within that as well, it's, as Marilyn was talking about before, it is about slow disclosure and going at the young person's pace a lot of the time, and just making sure that they're very, very aware of what needs to be shared and the reason for it.
Yeah. That's a good point, isn't it? So our, you know, in dealing with the family, we may have an agenda where we want things to happen very quickly, and we have to be on at their pace. Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Sarah. Marilyn, so you're dealing with the whole of, or your organisation's dealing with the whole of the family. How do you then collaborate and share information while still, and this might be within a community, within the Orthodox community, while still maintaining the, I guess, the confidentiality and you know, boundaries? How does that work?
You can imagine, Michelle, that that's kind of quite a quagmire of events. So, there are lots of things that's really important in this conversation that I think would be good to kind of take note of is, you know, one of the things that cold service providers who are a bit unique in our system have is often a really good understanding of the inner workings of a community. And I encourage people to consider, you know, developing an understanding of the cold providers in their communities that they work within their cohorts, and utilise them for secondary consultation to build their understanding of what's going on, particularly if they're working with a family or a young person whose community they're less familiar with. But in terms of confidentiality, you know, one of the challenges as a cold provider as well as a family service provider is many of our workers are also from community. And so we've purposefully done things like chosen a staffing cohort that's quite diverse. So we have non-Jewish staff along with those that are from the secular communities, those from the liberal communities, those from Orthodox and those from ultra-Orthodox, so that choice is there for anyone that engages. And when we start with a new family, and we work with the family as a whole, but generally it's led by the mother, as Usha said, you know, lots of migrant families, the mother is the one that does most of the help seeking initially, but we then also work with the adolescents separately. You know, we give them, we're very, very transparent about, you know, would you like to, are you comfortable speaking with someone from community? Do you want to speak to someone outside? So we're kind of very lucky because our social work cohort are from a very diverse area. But one of the biggest constraints to help seeking is fear that if you disclose what's going on, other people will find out. And so we are very, we continuously seek to check in with people that they feel comfortable with what they're saying. We reiterate our confidentiality stance very strongly. We also highlight, like Sarah said, our boundaries. So, you know, if someone is not safe, if there's risk, that we will work with them, but we will need to contact authorities. So we actively use SIS and FIS to gather information. So as a family service provider, we will use SIS, for example, around our child protection liaison that we'll do. So we'll do some history gathering. We might do that with police. We'll use FIS around our, you know, if there has been a family violence service engaged previously, or perhaps SAM's men's behaviour change, we're aware that they're involved, so we might engage them. So we do gather that using those information sharing tools. But as a COL provider, we also know that there are real great champions within our community. And so strategically, and this is what other services could get benefit from in engaging with a COL provider, is we know the rabbis and the communal leaders that are willing to stand up against family violence, are willing to assist men take responsibility. And so we'll start to weave in the ability to engage them, because change from within, we find, is much more effective than when an authority comes on top to create change. I don't know if that answered your question, Michelle, but it's such an interesting area that hopefully it went some way towards it.
I very much appreciate that I'm asking extremely difficult questions and giving you like 2 minutes to answer. So you're doing a great job. Asha, you're part of the Harmony project. And I wonder if you can let us know a little bit about that, but also in the context with RV and any mental health issues and what collaboration you might seek out.
Thank you. So with the Harmony project, what we are really doing is we're working with primary carers, such as general practitioners. So research has shown that nearly 5 women who present in general practice are being missed from being asked whether there's family violence at home. A number of South Asian communities, that's where the research is focusing on, South Asian communities, the women who come from there sometimes want the caregiver to ask, is there violence at home? So what we are trying to do is we are going through family violence education with the help of a GP educator and myself as the advocate educator. So we're trying to inform the GPs on how to ask and what to do if they ask and the women say that they are experiencing family violence. So really we are also getting them to recognize that they are the first point of call when women come there trying to disclose their violence or expecting to be asked. So as with your next question, Michelle, on the mental health. So also in this instance, what happens is definitely if the women are saying that there's been violence at home, we know that the children are also part of this environment and they would also be exposed to a chronic environment of violence, where a number of children can become traumatized. So meaning that they could be experiencing hypoarousal, meaning feelings of fear, feelings of having lost control, having trouble concentrating, and feeling negative about themselves. And again, experiencing depression, anxiety, and having a lot of problems with relationships, including their own family members, the mother and the father as well. And also when children are exposed to family violence, they could be having ruminative thoughts, constantly thinking what's going to happen next, or the same story playing in their mind as well, which prevents them from doing the work they need to do and being present. The other response that we see is children become avoidant, so they do not engage at all. They just almost in the frozen state, so they're unable to respond and avoid all circumstances where there are traumatic events. And also that's one way they're trying to seek emotional safety as well. So when we work with GPs, as we usually understand that the GP works with the entire family. So when a woman discloses that there's violence at home, the GP can also be more attuned to pick up if any of these presentations are apparent in the children as well. So, so really to work with the family holistically, but not to counsel the family together. It's not about counseling the husband and wife together, because there is a huge power differential when there's family violence at home.
Yeah, that's very important, isn't it? And probably equally as important not to necessarily counsel the adolescent around the parents in some cases as well.
Yes, yes. So we have been encouraging, especially our GP educator. What she does is she says to the family member who's coming in with the adolescent to say that if you could step outside for a few minutes, I just want to have a conversation with the adolescent. And she just says it as that it's her normal practice to speak to the adolescent by themselves. So that gives an opportunity for the adolescent to open up and share information if information needs to be shared.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Yeah, thanks, Asha. Finally, our final question is how do you consider the views and the wishes and the needs? Asha's kind of made a start with this. Of Avi, let's go back to the case study in the context of risk assessment and safety planning. So maybe I can start with Sarah. How do we do all of that and still keep assessment of risk and safety planning?
Yeah, so in line with MARAM, Avi's going to need his own risk assessment, because despite, the fact that they're all in the same home and experiencing similar violence, it is different violence. And so it's really important that Avi is assessed separately to his mum and to his siblings. And that way we can sort of formulate a treatment plan out of that. Avi at the moment is obviously resisting against some of the cultural aspects. So we would obviously offer up having a culturally sensitive agency work alongside us, but if he was a bit resistant to that, we would continue to do secondary consult, just so that we've got that in the forefront of our minds when working with him. The benefit of being a youth AD agency is we are working solely with Avi, so his views and wishes are always first. And like I was saying before, obviously there is we have to take into account mandatory reporting and that kind of stuff, but these are all conversations that we have in our initial sessions with Avi, so he's aware of some of the limitations within the work that we do. But every session that we step into, it's Avi leading it with what he's wanting to get out of the session. So those views and wishes are very much leading the treatment that we do with him. We work from a harm minimisation framework as well. So in terms of his substance use and perhaps some of the higher risk behaviours that he's engaging in, that's something that we'll work alongside with him as well in order to help keep him safe.
And do you find yourself sometimes at odds with the parents' views? How do you kind of balance that?
Especially coming from a harm minimisation framework, that is often creates a bit of conflict, unfortunately. We just try and educate is really sort of the standpoint that we come from. We understand that the way that we operate isn't going to be the same way that people want to operate at the home, and that's okay. So we really try and work within the parameters that we've got. And obviously working directly with the young people, the conversations we're having are educational based. It's a lot of psycho ed around the substances they're engaging in or the behaviours that they're engaging in as well. And we do a lot of referring out to agencies as well that can help, that can work directly with the parents as well, just so that, both the young person and the parents are using similar language and that everyone is sort of on the same page, and it just sort of helps to achieve some better outcomes. But absolutely, it's challenging. And where we can, we bring the parents in into the treatment as well as much as possible, because it's really, really pivotal for everyone to be included and everyone to work on the issue together.
Marilyn, have you got anything more to add in that light?
Yeah, of course. I think in terms of considering Avi's wishes and his needs, as a family service provider, it's important for us to understand and consider risk and safety planning, not just with Avi, but his mother and all the other children as well. So we take a lens that covers the family as a whole, but as a kind of a baseline, patience, a real steady hand, and what we call cultural humility is really central. So for Avi, help seeking is already hard for adolescents. From a cold community, it has, or from a religious community that has lots of rules and norms, it takes it to another sort of level. So we really want to have a parallel process of understanding adolescents, Avi's developmental needs, his need to separate and individuate, his questioning of his faith, his kind of experience at the home, alongside safety, alongside cultural need and religious need, and to marry that is really important, because there can be significant risks at a time if Avi's behaviour is seen by the family, which not going to religious studies or not doing school well or questioning smoking dope and questioning his marriageability, that's a real rejection of values, a rejection of beliefs and of their way of life, of the family's way of life. So it's a very risky time when that's disclosed in any way. So we have to kind of take a very steady approach and marry both Avi's needs to do what he wants to do, which may be separate, maybe have his own place, and maybe keep safe. His desire to keep his mum safe, which will be paramount, because as the eldest male in the family, as Usher talked about, he has a lot of responsibilities that he carries, but also just the need to make sure that whatever we put in place doesn't intensify the risk. Sometimes with cold communities, or sometimes with religious communities, perhaps, where, as it was described, Yossel uses, religious doctrine or religious stories to help justify behaviour. We can sometimes, with the assistance of our rabbi champions, use them to counter those sorts of narratives and to help remove blame and responsibility away from both the mother and from Avi back onto the father. So, Avi is absolutely central, and we would work very carefully with him not to kind of tip it so that he's at greater risk than he was at the start.
So what sort of community supports might be relevant in particularly with Avi's case?
So for us, Michelle, is that one of the things that when we engage predominantly with women, is that we check in with them to check whether the child is safe and how the children are coping with the given situation. And we always encourage what are the current, we always check in to see what are the current support mechanisms that they are using. So could be a neighbor, could be an aunt, could be extended family members where they feel safe as well. So we want to use what the children are already used to. If they are comfortable going to that space, that would be our first suggestion for Avi as well. If he's already seeing an aunt or grandma or other family members where he's feeling safe and there are children to play in that house. So we would say that is the first point, that's the first circle. And the next circle would be what we would suggest is the school communities as well, because they would have children in their classrooms where they're friends with, and some families may be able to connect with Avi as well. So those are the two main groups, circle of support that we would look at as well.
Yes, and another really good point is using, looking at the protective factors that are around and using that social network that, adolescents so connect with. Yeah.
So things that have already been established for the child, for Avi, that would be the first point of call before referring them out to external community groups.
Look, I'm going to leave the last question to you, Sam, in regard to working with directly with Yossel. You work with the men who are using family violence in this situation. How would you work with Yossel and while keeping Avi in focus? How would that happen?
Yes. Now, Michelle, as a whole, the work we do in the Men's Behavior Change Program, even if I take personally as well as the other facilitators, it's all about ensuring the safety of women and children. That's what we work towards. So, one thing is that also working collaboratively with the family safety worker. We keep getting information through our family safety worker weekly, because family safety worker would be speaking to Avi's mother and engaging her while engaging in the other services and getting what's happening at home. So when Yusel come to the program, he might not disclose what's actually happening, but then again, through the family safety contact, we have certain amount of information that is relevant for our practice. So collaboratively working with the family safety contact is an integral part of the whole program. Now, Yusel coming from a Orthodox Jewish background, there are no cultural specific group for this particular man, but there are, say, cultural specific groups in the men's behavior space, which is Arabic speaking group, and then there are South Asian groups for the men. The Arabic group is in language, but the South Asian group runs in English language. So Yusel would be coming to a mainstream group with other men, other 15 or 14 men. But still, we would be exploring the values in general, even with men who come from the mainstream groups. We will speak about the values they want to have in themselves. Being the father, being a male partner, what values do you work with? And then also family of origin is one of the main things that we focus on, where in these cultures, especially coming from core backgrounds, a lot of the cultures, a lot of the men carry this patriarchal sort of thinking, and they come from patriarchal societies. So we invite men. Men's Behavior Change Program is all about therapeutic intervention. So we invite men to speak about their values, their culture, their family of origin, which really helps us as facilitators in the work we do, as well as for the other men in the group. So we do challenge them respectfully in the groups. Men challenge each other over a period of time for their use of violence. But in this case, as I said at the beginning, the safety of women and children is a big part of the work we do. again, Alvi comes to mind in this particular scenario. We would be hearing about Alvi's behaviors at home from his mother when family safety contact engages. So obviously we keep an eye on the whole family of what is happening with this man.
Look, I could go on and on. I really want to, but I won't. We do have time restraints. So I just want to thank, firstly, our panellists for giving up their time this morning and being available. And it's just been really wonderful to hear the contributions that you've all made. There's a lot of points that I'm taking away as well. And I'm happy to say that for all those who have registered, you'll receive an email with an information pack based on resources from the organisations that have been represented here this morning. Yes, it's such a, as I said, such a complex issue, but I think it's been really highlighted really well this morning. So I'm going to leave you with the final, I suppose, an encouragement for you all as we've finished each webinar. We've basically reached the same points. What's the first start of how do we ensure that we do this work, taking all of our responsibilities in place is first educate, find out about the developmental needs of infants, of children, and of adolescents. And I'm not saying we all go off and do another degree of some description, but there are a lot of really useful resources out there to give us a snapshot at least. We need to also acknowledge young people's unique experiences of family violence. So I'm really pleased to say that Victoria has come a long way in defining what family violence, is in a legal sense. And we now know that children are victim survivors in their own right, regardless of even being present at the time of a violent incident. There's that knowledge that we're taking. And finally, identifying opportunities for cross collaboration. So I just think that the organisations that were represented here this morning just have opened up my eyes to what just the wealth of knowledge, and that I don't have to actually figure everything out myself. I can have conversations with others and do the best for families that I'm dealing with. So just thank you again, and also a big thank you to the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family, No to Violence, and Domestic Violence Victoria. And thank you for them for allowing me to have the opportunity to participate in this.